Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Journal Club hosted by the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. A recent special issue of Child Abuse and Neglect explored the current state of the science on measurement of maltreatment, as well as innovative statistical methods that can be applied to improve our approach to measurement. Co-editor Joy Gabrielli, PhD, a clinical psychologist and assistant professor at the University of Florida, will provide a broad overview of findings from the special issue, limitations in our current approaches, and recommendations for future research areas. Right now, I have everyone on mute to avoid background noise. We welcome you to enter your questions and comments in the questions box throughout the presentation. Dr. Gabrielli will answer any questions at the end as time permits. Dr. Joy Gabrielli is a clinical child psychologist with a program of research that explores risk and resilience processes in youth exposed to maltreatment. Her work during graduate school enabled her to play a central role in data collection and data analysis for a project called SPARK, Studying Pathways to Adjustment and Resilience in Kids, directed by Dr. Yo Jackson. As part of her graduate training, Dr. Gabrielli obtained a quantitative minor at the University of Kansas, and she applied novel quantitative methods to support the development of a more comprehensive measurement of child maltreatment. Since graduation, she has continued her work in improving measurement methods in child maltreatment. Joy, we thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your insights. Now I will turn it over to you. One moment, please.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Let me do this.
There we go. Now we've got the main slide with notes on the right. If you can switch it to full screen.
Try this.
Okay, great. Looks good.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to talk a little bit about this special issue that I worked on as a co-guest editor with Yo Jackson. I'm filling in for Yo today. She had some things come up that precluded her ability to do this webinar, but we worked very closely on this project as it was a topic of interest for both of us as we engaged in trying to identify a solid construct of maltreatment in the work that we did on the SPARK project. And so that really enhanced my learning in this field as I was a graduate student while I was working on that project. Really opened my eyes to the complexity that we can see in measurement of these multidimensional constructs. So I wanted to start out by providing a little bit of background on the foundation of this special issue and why we decided we wanted to participate in doing this special issue. So the background of this issue on the measurement of maltreatment was really founded from a place of frustration. So we as maltreatment researchers recognize how incredibly important maltreatment is for youth outcomes, how it relates to a host of negative outcomes for youth, such as family disruption, academic problems, etc., that are also related to negative outcomes for these youth in their development. There has been a rapidly growing literature on maltreatment exposure in youth with a particular focus on youth in foster care, given their high levels of maltreatment exposure. The problem is, one of the conflicts that Yo and I experienced as we were reviewing this literature is that there exists a large number of inconsistencies in findings, many of which we feel might relate to the varied way we are currently operationalizing the predictor, the maltreatment construct. So we wanted to address this issue, and we also were recognizing, in general, this is not an easy area of study. For a long time, we as a field struggled with the idea of even whether or not youth could safely and reliably self-report on these life experiences. And today, we now know that youth can self-report, and more often than not, they indicate a sort of sense of catharsis from telling their stories as a part of research. Despite this, though, it remains fairly common practice for us to use other reporter types, such as case file records, to obtain a given child's maltreatment profile. We also struggle to fully capture the complexity that comes with a variable such as maltreatment. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment, but in short, there are many aspects to maltreatment that contribute to its impact on child functioning and behavior, and some of these aspects are fairly difficult to operationalize. And in the context of research, in a climate where replicability is becoming more and more important, we must be asking ourselves if we can create these summary variables that are valid and reliable. We need some definition around the construct that can help us to summarize our findings across studies and provide some semblance of consistency in our approach to this measurement. So I want to poke a little bit of fun at the fact that we do have such a wide range of ways that we try to define maltreatment. It's sort of like the blind man and the elephant. And a lot of the issues, we believe, come from us capturing just one tiny part of this really important construct. We often look at a yes or no variable of did maltreatment occur, or we create dichotomous variables of if certain types of maltreatment occurred, whether it be sexual abuse, physical abuse, or neglect. Then eventually we recognized that dosing mattered. So we began to create measures of a number of different types of maltreatment or chronicity of maltreatment. Then we began to try to capture severity, which has been recognized as important in a number of different studies. And then we understood the importance of developmental timing. So we began to examine the number of developmental phases during which maltreatment occurred. My hypothesis at this point, and my hope, is that we will eventually move to understanding more the complexity of maltreatment exposure, which will be a way of capturing polyvictimization across multiple perpetrators and across multiple developmental phases, accounting for the complexity inherent within constructs such as severity and chronicity of exposures. So I want to start by laying a quick foundation of what I believe is the way that most people think about this construct. We generally start with 4 types of maltreatment exposure. There are other types, and I'll address that a little bit later on in this talk, but this is generally the basic starting point in the literature. So we have physical, sexual, and psychological or emotional abuse and neglect. And even in the studies that I'll present on today, we will see these 4 aspects of abuse as the primary aspects that are being captured when we talk about abuse type. We then have different ways of capturing more nuanced constructs across each type. And as a field, we are better at capturing these within some types than we are within other types. For example, we are better at capturing severity of physical or sexual abuse than we are at capturing severity of neglect. And I think that's partly due to the fact that it's easier to summarize acts of commission rather than acts of omission. But it's an area that we can think about as a field in terms of continuing to give attention to, because we know that neglect is very, very important for child outcomes. But our measurement process has begun to recognize these important factors for child outcomes. Things like severity of the experiences, who the perpetrator was, when the abuse began, and how long it lasted. And in my personal opinion, I think we've taken great strides in the literature in finding new ways to summarize these things. And we want to continue pushing that process and continue pushing our novel analytic approaches to support these changes and these trends in our measurement models. Generally, though, I don't believe we've truly maximized some of these new novel analytic methods. So I would like to give a quick example of some of the issues that arose, particularly when we were trying to develop a summary variable for the maltreatment construct in the SPARK project. And so we have things like confirmatory factor analysis that can be tested within a structural equation framework. And once we obtain a measurement model using these methods, we can then test for factorial invariance across groups and learn, are there significant differences in the latent means across age or gender or placement type. We've also seen an uptick in the number of studies that are using latent class analysis, and I'll talk a little bit more about that because we had a few studies submitted to the special issue specifically using LCA. And I'd also like to give a shout out for use of item response theory, which is a way of evaluating validity and reliability of our items for measurement of overarching constructs as well. But for the SPARK project, we were using a CFA within a structural equation modeling framework because we wanted to be able to test for factorial invariance across groups. And we wanted to provide a summary variable for our predictive models that captured a given child's maltreatment exposure as fully as possible. So we started out measuring these 4 main types of maltreatment exposure that I referenced before. So we followed suit with a lot of the other research that's been done in this area. And one of the issues that came up right away, as you can see in this summary table, is that youth were reporting multiple forms of maltreatment. So the majority of youth had more than 2 types of maltreatment that they had reported experiencing. So had we just categorized them by type of maltreatment, that wouldn't have really worked because we would have had these complex groups of multiple types of maltreatment exposures. So right off the bat, we recognized that just basic categorization by type would be a bit complicated to achieve. So we decided that we wanted to obtain a construct of severity and chronicity that we could model in our predictive models. And we wanted to account for these across each of the 4 types of maltreatment that we had captured in our assessment. And this was our hypothesized measurement model. And we worked for years, actually, to come to a point where we felt like we were adequately capturing severity across these different 4 categories and adequately capturing chronicity across these 4 categories. The problem was when we modeled this measurement model, we identified that our latent constructs were correlated at almost perfectly correlated, so 0.972, which essentially means that we're capturing a lot of the same information across both of our constructs. So our final measurement model, after years of work, ended up looking a bit like this, where we had a single latent factor of maltreatment exposure, including measures of both severity and chronicity across each type. And we were able to correlate residuals so that we were accounting for the shared variance that occurred within type. And our measurement model provided adequate fit to the data, as you can see by our fit statistics. And we were really proud of this model, but it took us a long time to get here, and there remain problems with it. So there certainly are different ways to approach this construct that might be more parsimonious or that might serve as a better predictor for outcomes. And the process of getting to this this construct was really meaningful for us. We were able to use this approach to test for differences in latent means, and our findings aligned with our hypotheses that we would see higher rates of maltreatment, severity, and chronicity in older youth and youth in residential facilities, but no significant differences across genders. But honestly, to get the measurement model to this point took our research team years. And as I said, there remain several problems within this model. And so this process of struggle around these different ways of measuring maltreatment is what led us to this idea to put a call out for the special issue. We wanted to draw attention to the problem, and we wanted to seek out novel ways to think about the construct as well as look for novel methods for capturing it. So we hoped, the greater scientific community would be able to present some novel approaches that we could learn from. And honestly, they did. I think there's still a lot of growth to be done in this area, but I'm going to try my best to walk you all through every study that was submitted to, or that was accepted for publication for this special issue. It's 10 studies, so it's a lot to cover. So I'm going to be giving kind of broad strokes of each one, but I would really encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about a specific study, to please go and look at the special issue, or feel free to contact me via email if you have additional questions. I'm happy to try to answer them. But there's a lot of different approaches that were presented in our special issue. So I want to start out with Yo Jackson's paper that she submitted as part of this special issue, entitled A Reasonably Large Review of Operationalization in Child Maltreatment Research, Assessment Approaches and Sources of Information in Youth Samples. So we started out the special issue with this selective review that Yo had completed on the ways that maltreatment had been measured across 10 years of research and 3 journals that each had a primary focus on child maltreatment. And this resulted in a final sample of 338 studies. Approximately 68% were studies that were conducted in the US. And inclusion criteria for articles in this study were that the study approach examined and measured maltreatment specifically. The sample had to include participants between the ages of 0 and 18 years. The article was written in English. The study was not a retrospective account of an adult recalling their childhood experiences, so it had to be a youth recall or prospective. And the study was an empirical or original research article. Studies that examined maltreatment but did not measure the construct directly within the research were not included. So for example, if a study included youth exposed to child abuse or included youth in foster care but did not measure the youth's abuse exposure, those studies would not be included for this review. And what they found was that the vast majority of studies did measure multiple forms of maltreatment, so about 72%, which is a positive finding. We were excited by this finding because that means folks are recognizing the complexity inherent within maltreatment exposures. This was followed by primarily studies looking at sexual abuse, about 17%, a smaller number looking at physical abuse, about 6%, an even smaller number looking at neglect, and then the very smallest number looking at emotional abuse, which was less than 1% of studies. And across studies, the dimensions that were most commonly assessed were type. Type was assessed in almost every single study that they analyzed. So obviously the field recognizes the importance of type and continues to prioritize type as a dimension of interest. Severity of maltreatment was assessed in about a third of the studies. Frequency was assessed in about a quarter of the studies, and chronicity was assessed in less than 10% of studies. And I can speak from personal experience in saying chronicity is a complex construct to capture. It's difficult to summarize and have that be unique from other factors like frequency and severity. So that's a challenge for the field that I think we all need to continue to emphasize and work on because we know that chronicity also is important for youth outcomes. I wanted to show you this graph from the Jackson study, which basically demonstrates these different dimensions and the proportion of studies across each year. So we could see if there were any trends. And what we saw is that all dimensions were captured in less than 40% of articles each year. And we're seeing relatively minimal change in the proportion of variables noted across the 10-year span. They did look at international differences, so US studies compared to international studies. And what they found was actually more similarities existed across the way that studies assessed maltreatment than differences. There were a few exceptions found specifically around types of abuse. So the proportion of studies focusing on neglect was more than 2 times greater for samples in the US as compared to studies using international samples. Whereas in the international group, they tended to focus more on sexual abuse than the US samples did. So some interesting differences there. It might be about culture, might be about constructs that are deemed being part of the maltreatment construct or not. I don't know the specific reason why those differences exist, but still an important factor for us to consider, especially when we're summarizing results across studies. And in general, Jackson and colleagues identified a few issues that they noticed from their work. One issue was type was across the board the primary focus, so type of maltreatment exposure. If a study focused primarily on one type, other types weren't necessarily measured. So a study that was focused specifically on sexual abuse may not have controlled for the confound of co-occurring other types of abuse, which is problematic because we know, at least for foster care samples and juvenile justice involved samples, co-occurrence of maltreatment is the norm. So we want to be mindful of that, and also mindful of that as we think about standards of our field. Severity measures often focused more on perpetrator behavior, not necessarily on the consequence of the maltreatment. So they were looking at what did the perpetrator do, not what was the outcome in terms of injury for the child. And so there's different ways that we can think about severity. We in the Spark Project conceptualized it as risk for injury. So we wanted to capture that the more injurious or invasive an experience would be, potentially the more severe that exposure was. She also noted a need for more multifaceted measurement of maltreatment that assesses across these different domains. So we want to account for type, but we also want to account for other things like severity and frequency and chronicity. And there's a need to recognize associated forms of adverse life experiences beyond just the maltreatment exposure. So we know that youth who are exposed to child maltreatment are at increased risk for other ACE experiences. And so we want to account for the fact that if you are maltreated, you have higher risk for placement disruption, you have higher risk for school failure or exposure to parental substance use. And all of this really gives rise to the need for more complex measurement approaches. And as I mentioned before, one aspect we saw in articles submitted for our special issue included the use of LCA, or latent class analysis, as a means for summarizing across these different potential dimensions. So we had 4 manuscripts submitted that utilized LCA methods, and I think this is actually representative of an emerging trend in the field of maltreatment research. So generally, I think research groups are recognizing the limitations we see with traditional measurement approaches. The thing that we need to look out for, though, is I think along with this comes the potential for some growing pains in terms of replicability and interpretability. And we saw this in our review process, where these were the primary concerns of reviewers when they were analyzing some of these papers. So latent class analysis is really this nice person-centered statistical method that identifies an unmeasured class membership. It groups kids based on their class membership. And you can evaluate these different class solutions for their interpretability, clinical utility, and replicability, which I think is really important to do if your study is going to have meaningful impact on the field. And when you use LCA, this creation of a latent class solution allows for a more parsimonious representation of these different complex, multiply measured dimensions. So I think the approach can actually be useful, as complex as it is, for simplifying some of our findings and helping us address the complexity of these dimensions. So we'll start off by talking about the article by Warmingham and colleagues, which was identifying maltreatment subgroups with patterns of maltreatment subtype and chronicity, a latent class analysis approach. And in this study, researchers sought to use this latent class analysis approach to identify distinct classes of children. And they identified them by the presence and number of specific subtypes of these 4 types of maltreatment that we've discussed before: emotional, physical, sexual abuse, and neglect. And they also wanted to account for chronicity of experiences across developmental phases of childhood, which again is getting at a gap that we have in our literature, really utilizing chronicity as an important variable of interest. And they also wanted to describe how latent classes functioned in terms of prediction for child functioning, specifically looking at differences in behavioral or emotional functioning across the different identified latent classes. So they produced a sample of 674 low-income urban children, and about half of these youth had documented identified maltreatment exposure. And they summarized the maltreatment across the four types described above. They also provided a dosing factor of the number of types that were experienced, so just a count across the 4 types, and also the chronicity of their maltreatment exposure across these different developmental periods. And so what we saw here was that they obtained a 4-class solution. And so within the 4-class solution, they had 3 maltreatment classes identified, in addition to the non-maltreated class, which was the majority of the sample, about 48%. Of the 3 maltreatment classes, the largest maltreatment class was the chronic multi-subtype class. which accounted for about 30% of the total sample. In this class, youth had a higher likelihood of multiple types of maltreatment exposure, as well as higher probabilities for the experiences of neglect and emotional maltreatment. And members within this class had at least 2 or more of the subtypes, the 4 subtypes of maltreatment, with a high probability of experiencing maltreatment across more than one phase of development. So this is a higher risk maltreatment subgroup. The next largest class was about 16% of the total sample had a high probability of neglect, which is why they're labeled the neglect-only class, which is useful and helpful for interpretation. The majority had experienced neglect across one developmental period. And then the smallest maltreatment class was a single subtype, which aligns with what we know about the fact that maltreatment subtypes co-occur. And this class was characterized by having a moderate probability of sexual abuse, physical abuse, and emotional maltreatment, with a low probability of exposure to neglect. And typically, children in this group had experienced only one subtype of maltreatment, and they tended to experience maltreatment in only one developmental period. And authors in the study also utilized these subgroups to examine mean score differences across a range of different outcomes, so externalizing, internalizing, emotional dysregulation, depression, and anxiety. And they found meaningful differences when comparing across different groups. So generally, the chronic multi-subtype group, which is number 3 here in these pairwise comparisons, demonstrated higher levels of pretty much everything, externalizing, emotional dysregulation, depression, and anxiety, as compared to the non-maltreated group. And then the neglect-only group demonstrated higher levels than the non-maltreated group across externalizing and dysregulation, emotional dysregulation. My hypothesis around this issue of no differences in terms of internalizing across groups is that they're using the teacher report form of internalizing, and we know in general that that adult caregivers, teachers, counselors are less good at identifying symptoms of internalizing than child self-report. And so we see a little bit of potential internalizing difficulties in these self-reported measures of depression and anxiety. So I think that's part of the reason why there are some inconsistent findings across these groups. So generally what we're seeing is that children in this chronic multi-subtype class are demonstrating higher levels of pathology across multiple outcomes being assessed. And this is a nice example of a study that's providing really interesting findings, a class solution that's highly interpretable, and hopefully something that we can replicate. I'd love to see a replication of this study to learn if these classes can be identified in a different sample. Durkhuizen and colleagues also utilized latent class analysis as well as latent transition analysis. So their study was entitled Developmental Timing of Polyvictimization, Continuity, Change, and Association with Adverse Outcomes in Adolescence. And they built on prior studies using this latent transition analysis to simultaneously estimate these similar classes by age, as well as the probabilities of moving between classes by age of trauma exposure. So they were able to predict future class assignment based on this LTA analysis while adjusting their results for any uncertainty related to their class placement that were provided in the predictive models. So what they found is they utilized a data set of 3,754 adolescents, and they found that they were able to identify a high and low exposure subgroup across these 3 different phases of development: early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescence. And in early childhood, the low exposure subgroup had a mean of 1.8 traumatic stressors, and this represents, the high exposure subgroup represents a subgroup of youth combined from 2 LCA classes. So the early childhood LCA had 3 subclasses, low risk, and then 2 subclasses of high risk. In the middle childhood group, their low exposure subgroup had a distinguishing factor from the high exposure subgroup as well. And in the high exposure subgroup, they were comprised of members from 4 latent classes. So there were 5 latent classes total for the middle childhood group. And similarly for the adolescent group, they had a low exposure subgroup and then a distinguishing factor from high exposure subgroups that was comprised of 4 different LCA classes. And what was very interesting about their findings in the study is that membership in the high exposure group in either early or middle childhood was associated with membership in the higher exposure group in subsequent developmental periods. So youth sustained in their exposure level if they were in the high exposure group. So high exposures begot high exposures in the future. In the low exposure subgroup, there were some variability across developmental phases where we saw some shifts from those groups, from those individuals into higher exposure groups. So we saw a little bit more in terms of variability for low exposure groups as compared to high exposure groups, which is suggestive of the fact that we're not doing a great job, I think, of preventing continued exposure in this higher level group. This study also examined persistent polyvictimization as a predictor of internalizing, externalizing, and PTSD symptoms while adjusting for gender. And on average, we saw that persistent polyvictimization was predictive of CBCL scores as well as PTSD scores. And each period where an adolescent was classified as high exposure added 1.5 to 1.7 standard score points to the CBCL total score. So we see that there are strong associations persisting. And then if you look in table 4, for the CBCL total score, as well as the PTSD scores, we see that persistent high exposure across the 3 developmental periods were associated with higher scores than those in the reference group of the persistent low exposure. So it's also associated with higher CBCL internalizing scores than we see in the persistent low exposure group. So in general, we're seeing that chronicity and developmental stage of exposure are meaningful for youth outcomes, both in the likelihood of continued victimization, as well as for behavioral and emotional functioning of youth. And this is a finding that we will continue to see across the studies that I describe. So Brown and colleagues wanted to examine LCA to identify subgroups of children with polyvictimization and other adversities across developmental stages as well. So they did a similar study with a different sort of approach. So their study was entitled "The Co-Occurrence of Adverse Childhood Experiences Among Children Investigated for Child Maltreatment, a Latent Class Analysis." And in general, they wanted to be able to identify these latent classes of ACE exposures across developmental stages using the National Survey of Child and Adolescent Wellbeing. And they divided their participants across these developmental groups, so infants, preschool-aged, school-aged, and adolescents. And they were able to identify subgroups of children with polyvictimization and other adversities across each of these stages. So in the infant group, 3 latent classes were identified, as well as for the preschool-aged and school-aged group, or as well as for the preschool-aged and adolescent group. A 4-class solution was identified for the school-aged children. So we've now had a few manuscripts focusing on this issue of developmental nuances in the way that we capture the maltreatment construct. And I want to show you, this next slide is a little bit overwhelming, I think, but I wanted to be able to depict for you the different latent class solutions across the 4 different developmental stages that were assessed. So I recognize that this isn't a very easy set of images to read, but I was trying to fit all 4 graphs onto one slide for comparison. So you can see the factors that were assessed below, things like physical neglect, sexual abuse, caregiver substance abuse, and caregiver incarceration. And you can see how each class was scored across each developmental phase. So we have our infant graph at the top, our preschool age, our school aged, and then our adolescent group at the bottom. And I'd like to just highlight the fact that we see greater class distinction in each of these different developmental phases and areas that are related to caregiver functioning, particularly for these younger groups here, the infants and the preschool age groups. As compared to something that we would typically assess like sexual abuse, you can see is not really distinguishing across any of the groups, or physical abuse, which does a little bit better in terms of distinguishing, but not much. And we'll see a similar distinction in the Marion study that we're going to be talking about next. Also, as difficult as neglect is to capture, as I mentioned before, we do see physical neglect serving as a fairly consistent contributor to class distinction across age groups. So you can see that most clearly in the adolescent group, where there's a good level of distinction across these groups among the physical neglect measure. And what authors also noted is that at each developmental stage of this study, one class of children emerged who had exposure to a level of compound risks. So this really demonstrates that there's quite a range of variance in the level of child welfare investigated families, and that approximately 1/3 of investigated families across each developmental phase are being exposed to multiple risk factors, which we know has great meaning for outcomes for these youth. So moving on to Marion's and colleagues, they provided a study on the outcomes related to adverse childhood experiences in college students, comparing a latent class analysis and cumulative risk. So the purpose here was really to look at these two methods and determine the clinical and research utility of each approach. They utilized about 9,000 undergraduate students who are participating in the College Student Health Survey, and they were able to obtain a 4-class solution with the latent class analysis. So their classes were those who had high levels of ACEs, a group who had moderate risk of nonviolent household dysfunction. So an example of this would be if parents were abusing substances, emotional and physical child abuse exposure, and a group who had relatively low ACEs. And sort of the overarching finding of the study is when they compared this latent class approach here with the cumulative risk approach, which was essentially just a sum score across whether or not they had an exposure to these ACE experiences, they were able to have models that provided similar amounts of variance explained across 4 outcomes assessed. So college student mental health, physical health, alcohol use consequences, and academic performance. So I think what's interesting about this study is that it gives rise to the idea that parsimony might be useful at times. And so a cumulative risk approach can sometimes be just as effective as latent class approaches. And so I wanted to just give you a look at these different 4 classes and how they were represented across these different factors being assessed. So you see this high ACEs group at the top in the non-dashed line, solid line, and then you see the moderate risk of nonviolent household dysfunction, the group with emotional and physical child abuse, and the group with low ACE exposure. And what they saw comparing across the latent classes is that the largest difference identified in outcomes were between those who had high ACE exposure and those who had low ACE exposure. They weren't able to identify significant differences between the moderate risk of nonviolent household dysfunction group and the emotional and physical child abuse classes. So these findings, when compared to the cumulative risk approach, were really similar. So both approaches accounted for roughly equivalent amounts of variance explained in all outcomes. Then we saw an approach from Brumley, and Jaffe comparing cumulative index and factor analytic approaches to measuring maltreatment in the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health. And so as adults in this study, participants reported on previous childhood experiences of exposure to physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, supervisory neglect, and any level of social service investigation. And they also used a cumulative approach, a cumulative index approach, which was essentially just a dichotomized sum score across each of these domains, and compared that to using a factor analytic approach, where they sought to identify if there was a single factor or a two-factor model. And in their factor analytic approach, they were able to identify a two-factor model here. You can see the factor loadings for each one of these categories. So we can see a pretty clear set of loadings onto factor 1, and then a pretty clear set of loadings onto factor 2. The social services investigations had some loading on factor 1 as well, but they kept it associated more with factor 2 because it was a higher loading. And then they wanted to determine whether these different measurement approaches provided evidence of convergent validity across these lifetime and prospective outcomes. And so in this study, they utilized predictive models across wave 3 and wave 4 of data. But in my presentation, I'm just going to present the table on wave 3 because it's just too much information for the slides. And in general, what they found was that cumulative index approach was a significant predictor across all outcomes. And in general, the index explained approximately 2 to 7% of the variance in lifetime incidence outcomes, which is what we see here, and a little bit less than or equal to 2% of variance that was in wave 4 outcomes, which is not presented on the slide. Overall, though, the latent factors were able to explain more of the variance in outcomes. So you can see those levels here, where the latent factors are providing somewhere in the range of 16 to 40% of the variance in wave 3 outcomes and 1 to 6% in variance in wave 4 outcomes. So this is to be expected that latent factors would provide a higher level of explanatory power compared to a cumulative index, because latent factors tend to retain more information than cumulative index approaches. So in general, the latent factors provided much stronger prediction for wave 3 outcomes, but neither approach really provided significantly or very strong prediction of wave 4 outcomes. However, the latent approach did provide marginally better associations. So in this study, the approach supports more of a factor analytic approach than use of a cumulative index approach, which contradicts a little bit with what we just talked about in previous studies. So it's really about understanding more the pattern of child maltreatment experiences than just a simple count of the types of maltreatment experiences that they reported. And I think this goes back to the idea that your measure should align with the aim of your study and the purpose. And if parsimony is the purpose, then perhaps a cumulative risk approach makes more sense. But if variance in the outcome is what you're interested in, providing the greatest variance explained in your outcome, then a latent construct approach might make more sense. So we also have some issues that I mentioned in terms of there's areas of maltreatment that remain understudied. So we have become fairly comfortable with these 4 primary types of maltreatment: physical, sexual, and psychological abuse and neglect, as we're seeing across pretty much all of these studies and studies that I myself have done. I think in general, we as a field still struggle at capturing the neglect construct. I think we have more work to be done there. We're not as good at capturing that construct as we are some of these other types of abuse. And also more recent attention has been given to the highly impactful factor of psychological abuse. But again, I think we have more work to be done there, particularly with this form of abuse as our primary factor of interest. And we have continued work needed to be able to identify other forms of maltreatment that have gone understudied. So for example, in the adult literature, there's been some work examining the idea of disability-specific abuse, which would be withholding of medical care needed to support chronic illness or disability, or removing assistive technology or assistive devices so that somebody can't access help or access care. And this could potentially be a distinct form of maltreatment that functions differently for individuals with disability than these other forms of maltreatment. And I think we should, as a field, continue to explore some of these novel ideas. We unfortunately didn't have any studies published in this domain, but I do think it's an area that could use additional attention. So we do have some studies that were submitted looking at some of these issues. Brzezinski and colleagues provided a paper called Childhood Emotional Abuse Characteristics, Moderate Associations with Adult Psychopathology and Caregiving. And they were hoping to identify these distinct contributions and interactive effects of emotional abuse frequency and intensity that might serve to impact adult outcomes, as well as caregiver-related outcomes. So they looked at the frequency and intensity, which I think is also sort of an indicator of severity, of emotional abuse across 62 caregivers, and looked at its association with adult psychopathology as well as caregiving behaviors. The three major strengths I see from this study are first and foremost the focus primarily on emotional abuse. I think that it's lovely that the authors highlighted this form of abuse as influential for outcomes. I think the emphasis on the caregiver and caregiving relationship as outcomes of interest also is really important as they relate to risk for re-victimization as well as generational cycles of violence. And the authors included covariates of childhood physical abuse and childhood sexual abuse, recognizing the associations that may exist across multiple forms of abuse exposure, even though their attention was primarily on childhood exposure to emotional abuse. And what they found was frequency and intensity emerged as orthogonal characteristics of childhood emotional abuse exposure. And they also provided differential effects on some of their measures of adult outcomes. And they had several null findings on childhood experiences of maltreatment and adult pathology and caregiving outcomes. But in support of their hypothesis, what they did find was that higher frequency of childhood emotional abuse was predictive of higher levels of adult psychopathology, regardless of intensity. And this is consistent with previous findings. They also found that frequency was not significantly associated with problematic caregiving behaviors or caregivers' representations. And they also demonstrated that higher childhood emotional abuse intensity predicted a problem in terms of caregivers' representations around boundary dissolution. So parents who had higher levels of childhood emotional abuse intensity struggled in terms of their role identification as a parent versus their role identification with their child. And I wanted to just demonstrate or depict this one association that they found when they were looking at interactive hypotheses. They noted that the effect of higher frequency of childhood emotional abuse on negativity in caregiving representation, so sort of thinking negatively about your child or about your role as a parent, was indeed moderated by intensity of childhood emotional abuse experiences. So high frequency childhood emotional abuse that was also indicated by high intensity factors had an association with less negativity in caregiving representations, whereas high frequency of childhood emotional abuse that was characterized by low intensity did not demonstrate that same negative association. And it's very interesting, and authors noted that the effects that they observed in this study were more related to caregivers' representations and not as much on the actual behaviors of caregivers, which suggests that there's more work to be done in these domains. Panlilio and colleagues also looked at a novel form of negative life experience. They provided a manuscript entitled Assessing Risk of Commercial Sexual Exploitation Among Children Involved in the Child Welfare System. And in general, they were hoping to develop a risk factor screening method to assess youth risk for commercial sexual exploitation. And I think this is a really interesting concept because there's this idea that at times your maltreatment exposure or features of your maltreatment exposure might invoke risk for additional maltreatment exposures or additional ACEs. And here, the additional maltreatment considered is this commercial sexual exploitation of children in foster care, which could be constructed also as a form of maltreatment. What's also interesting about this study is they utilized item response theory to develop this screen. And I think IRT for scale development is really interesting. It's relatively new in the field of maltreatment, but has great promise for assessment of maltreatment exposure. And when you think about IRT modeling, you might think about using it if you're interested in individual item characteristics, or if the purpose of the study is to examine measurement characteristics of a new scale, or if a scale hasn't received enough evidence for validation in your population of interest. So it's a theory of assessment based on relationship between individuals' performances on a test item, which can be considered like item difficulty, and the test taker's level of performance on the overall measure of the ability. So it's more of a person parameter or a latent trait of the individual. And that latent trait is the target to the reason that the item test was designed, the thing that the item test was designed to measure. And so what they found was they were able to identify these risk factors that were retained in their assessment of risk. So self-report of runaway behaviors, substance use, experience of serious injury, sexual activity prior to age 14, suicidality, exposure to severe violence, and hitchhiking. And the bolded items here are those that provided the highest level of discrimination in identifying those at risk for sexual exploitation versus those not at risk. And I wanted to provide this figure which shows the ICC values, the item characteristic curves, for the final model containing those final items reported. And so you can see the better performing items are these ones with a bit of the S curve to, with a bit of the S curve to them. So this idea of runaway behaviors is here in this straight line, and then you have hitchhiking behaviors here. And you can see how these provide a little bit different level of information. And the total information curve, which is not shown, also indicated with all items taken together, reliable information was able to be obtained about severity of risk for this exposure, particularly when individuals had higher levels of severity. So general findings from this study suggested that simply summing a screening measure and creating a cutoff score might be inaccurate, and they might need to take into account how much each item may be better at discriminating individuals at high or low severity of risk. And Briggs, Gowan, and colleagues also provided a bi-factor model to identify a multidimensional measurement model of family violence that resulted in 3 factors. They had a shared family violence factor, an intimate partner violence factor, and then a physically harsh parenting factor. And they're able to use this model to examine unique associations among individual family violence factors and child outcomes while accounting for impact of the shared violence factor, which also had significant associations with outcomes. And they were able to utilize a calibration sample, then replicate findings with a validation and lab visit samples. And they showed that children's symptoms and impairment showed relatively strong and consistent associations with the shared factor. And the physically harsh parenting factor was uniquely associated with things like activity impulsivity, inattention, aggression, and low concern for others. There were also some unique associations observed with IPV and harsh parenting, and the shared family violence factor was positively associated with problematic discipline as well. And so these graphs just demonstrate some of the differences across these different groups. So figure A is just on the frequency of harsh parenting behaviors by quartiles across some of these domains assessed. And the letter values denote when significant differences across groups occurred. So there's no significant differences across the moderate and high group denoted with the level C, with the letter C's here, but there were significant differences noted between the low, mild, and moderate groups. This just demonstrates the level of information that you can get with some of these novel approaches. So generally, we're seeing some evidence for considering shared variance in some of the factors we address in our research. And we want to make sure in general that we're accounting for shared variance with potential confounds. And this approach is an interesting look at ways we can consider doing this with a bi-factor method. And then Kugler and colleagues wanted to assess the effects of substantiated and unsubstantiated investigations of child maltreatment and subsequent adolescent health. And how could we possibly do an issue on measurement of maltreatment without at least one discussion of substantiation? So here what they found is that comparison females without any CPS contact were matched on the following demographic characteristics: race, family, income, age, and family structure. And they utilized propensity score methods to strengthen any type of causal influence on the effect of investigations and substantiations on later female adolescent risk behaviors and health outcomes. And what they found is no matter the level of investigation and substantiation, with any level of investigation, regardless of substantiation, females were more likely to have these negative outcomes of becoming teen mothers, engaging in HIV risk behaviors, and using drugs compared to females with no investigated report. So substantiation was not meaningful for these outcomes. And this table essentially demonstrates that same finding, that the effect of substantiation was not meaningful for these different groups, which suggests in general that we should be considering both substantiated and unsubstantiated reports in our research. And we can include this factor as a covariate or control, but that we should not necessarily be making our cut at the level of substantiation when we're interested in some of these negative health outcomes. So in general, I'm going to zip through some of these recommendations because of the time, but we want to try to triangulate our constructs whenever possible, and we can do this through using multiple reporting sources. And we found through other research that youth self-report often provides more information than things that we would get from case file records or other reporters. So we want to utilize youth self-report when possible. We want to try our best in our research approaches to capture as much of the construct as possible. And things like developmental stages of exposure and maltreatment context really do matter. So we should be accounting for some of these factors as well. We want to use novel methods to capture our constructs and to assess for developmental status. So things like LCA and IRT are interesting approaches that can support our work in this area. We also need to recognize the importance of general family dysfunction as well as other ACE exposures when we're trying to completely capture these childhood exposures to negative life events like maltreatment. We should be considering both substantiated and unsubstantiated cases when we're thinking about our inclusion criteria, but meaningful group differences might remain. So we want to continue to measure that and have that variable as part of what we're looking at in terms of group differences. We also want to recognize that there are high rates of co-occurring maltreatment exposures, and so it's difficult to do a study purely on sexual abuse without assessing other things like emotional abuse, neglect, or physical abuse. So we should be accounting for some of these other things. As a field, like every other behavioral health science field right now, we should be seeking to replicate our findings, particularly when we're developing things like latent classes, so that we can demonstrate that these classes are meaningful. And we have remaining understudied areas like disability-specific abuse, where we need to continue to develop our ideas around these different constructs. In general, I just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Yo Jackson, who was the PI of the SPARK project and was my co-guest editor and supported all of this work as we developed this special issue. As always, we want to thank youth participants who share their life experiences with us, our agency partners, and the funding agencies who support our ongoing research. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Joy. You have covered a lot of methodology and a lot of findings from recent years. We appreciate the information. We do have a few questions from the audience. Several questions revolve around the data tools and techniques themselves. You've spoken a lot about methodology, but can you speak a bit to perhaps if there are some gold standard tools that were used across multiple studies or tools you would recommend?
Honestly, I think that's an area that we need further work in. So the Jackson et al. Study does actually evaluate that. I just didn't have time to cover all of that in detail, but they provide additional information. So for whoever that question is related to, if you look up the Jackson study, they will give you like tabled information as well as in-text information about what measures were commonly used and what the strengths and weaknesses of those measures were. There are limitations, though, inherent within all of these measures, which I think is that we continue to develop our own measures because we're dissatisfied with the level of information that's provided. So I really encourage folks who are using measures of maltreatment to think about, are you getting some level of information on perpetrator? Are you getting some level of information on severity? Are you getting some level of information on chronicity? As well as recognizing that the 4 primary types of abuse might not be capturing somebody's full experience. And that's why a lot of us develop our own tools. So for the SPARK project, we use the Modified Maltreatment Classification System, which I love, which is basically a coding system used in the long scan studies that we developed into a self-report measure. And I'm sure, you know, we or others would be happy to share that with folks if folks were interested.
Great. And in terms of tools then, is the availability or lack of availability a reason why, for example, emotional abuse or emotional neglect is so much less studied than other forms?
That's a good question. I think that's probably part of it. It's difficult to develop those questions, just like it's difficult to develop those questions for neglect. I think we struggle at providing comprehensive measures that are worded in a consistent way across maltreatment types that actually capture the construct we're seeking to capture. But there have been studies that have been looking more and more at psychological maltreatment, and so I think we're getting more data on those measures. But the relational stuff is really challenging because it's so nuanced and difficult to summarize across individuals. I can just speak from a clinical perspective. I've done a number of reports to CPS over the past couple months, multiple involving psychological maltreatment, and none of them sounded anywhere near the same. So the kids can report a range of different exposures in that field in particular, which I think is challenging. We're not great at capturing that in case file records as well, I'll say.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here about, and you may have touched on this, but asking if there are studies that not only look at cumulative effects of multiple forms of abuse, but if there are studies that look at secondary effects, and this person gives examples of self-harm, substance abuse, et cetera, or compound outcomes.
Yeah, so I mean, it's easy for me to talk about my own stuff, I guess. But one of the study, my dissertation project was on this cumulative maltreatment exposure and substance use in adolescents. And so I do know there's several people who are studying this right now and are interested in the idea of these risk factors. So the development of health risk behaviors that then increase one's risk for re-victimization, I think is really interesting and important. And so the idea of you know, these adverse childhood experiences that then develop into higher risk for continued adverse childhood experiences, I think is really important. But yes, there are emerging studies on that, and I'm happy via email to communicate with folks about those and where they can look for more information on that.
Okay, great. Well, we are about out of time. I'm going to switch the screen back here. One last question an audience member had was about getting like a bibliography of the studies that you spoke about. I suppose they could perhaps get that on the Elsevier website.
Yeah, so they're all found in the same special issue. That's the title of this talk from the Journal of Child Abuse and Neglect. So the 10 studies are all found in that same special issue.
Okay, great.
But I can also add a references slide to this slide deck if that's helpful.
Okay. That would be great. So that's a good segue here to our conclusion. A recording of this webinar and a PDF version of Dr. Gabrielli's slides will be available within 24 hours on the ISPCAN website. We encourage all of you to become members of ISPCAN so we can continue having webinars like these in the future. And also, if you are interested in presenting a webinar or have ideas for topics, we would love to hear from you. Please contact me at resources@ispcan.org. Thank you again for all of you for joining us today, and to Dr. Gabrielli, and we hope that you have a good day or night wherever you are. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you.